In 2010, Greece didn't default. It was repossessed, not by soldiers or tanks, but by spreadsheets, interest rates, and bailouts with strings attached. What began as a debt crisis ended as a quiet takeover. Public services were sold, wages slashed, democracy sidelined in favor of technocratic control. And who profited? The banks that fueled the debt, the institutions that came to rescue. Greece became the test subject for a European system where solidarity felt like punishment. An economy shrunk by 25%. A population stripped of choice. But this story is not just about Greece. It's about what happens when money outweighs sovereignty, and what that means for the future of every nation. It began with a promise, a shared future, a united currency, a continent without borders, only opportunity. The euro was more than money. It was the symbol of progress, of modernity, of belonging. In 2001, Greece was welcomed into that vision. The drachma disappeared, the euro arrived, and with it came confidence. Interest rates dropped. Borrowing became easier and cheaper. For the first time, Greece could raise money like the richest nations in Europe. Billions flowed in, roads were built, airports expanded, public workers hired. Retirement came early, wages rose, the economy looked strong, investors cheered, markets responded. Greece was no longer on the periphery, it was part of the European core. But underneath the optimism, cracks were forming. To qualify for the euro, Greece needed to meet strict financial targets. It didn't, so it adjusted the numbers. With help from global investment banks like Goldman Sachs, debts were hidden in complex instruments. Deficits were masked, liabilities reclassified. On paper, it all looked clean. But the numbers weren't honest. They were engineered. Behind the growth was borrowing. And behind the borrowing was a fragile foundation. Yet no one asked the hard questions. European institutions turned a blind eye. Credit rating agencies gave their blessing. Politicians celebrated the illusion. Why? Because everyone wanted the story to be true, that Europe was united, that Greece was stable, that the dream was working. But growth built on illusion does not last, and debt, no matter how cleverly hidden, always comes due. The tragedy of Greece did not begin with collapse. It began with applause. Because the most dangerous part of any crisis is when no one believes it is possible. The illusion did not break slowly. It shattered. In 2008, the global financial system cracked open. Banks fell. Markets froze. Panic spread across continents. What began in Wall Street spread to every corner of the world. Investors searched for safety. They began to look closer at risk. And when they looked at Greece, what they saw terrified them. The numbers did not add up. The debt was far higher than anyone had admitted. The deficit was not 6% of GDP. It was more than 12. Trust vanished overnight. Greek bonds, once considered safe, were suddenly toxic. Yields soared. Borrowing costs exploded. Greece could no longer finance itself. By 2010, it was locked out of the markets entirely. The European dream turned into a European emergency. Leaders rushed to contain the damage. They feared not only for Greece, but for the entire euro. And so, the Troika arrived. The International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, the European Commission. They came with promises of stability, a rescue plan, a lifeline, 110 billion euros to save the nation. But it was not a rescue. It was a trade. In exchange for money, Greece had to surrender control. Austerity, privatization, structural reform, cut pensions, raise taxes, sell assets, reduce spending. The medicine was harsh, and it came with interest. Hospitals lost funding, schools closed, public workers were dismissed, unemployment exploded. The economy began to collapse inward. The bailout money flowed not to the people, but to the creditors. European banks were repaid. The system was stabilized, but Greece was left bleeding. The headlines called it recovery. The people called it betrayal, because Greece was not being saved. It was being stripped, and as the markets calmed, a new truth emerged. In the world of debt, salvation always comes with a price. The bailout came, but the recovery never did. Public wages were slashed, pensions gutted, taxes raised on everything from fuel to food. Austerity was not a policy suggestion, it was an obligation. Over the next few years, the Greek economy collapsed by a quarter. GDP fell by 25%. Unemployment soared to 27%. Youth unemployment passed 50%. A generation was locked out of its own future. As the economy shrank, desperation grew. To meet debt repayments, Greece was forced to sell what it still owned: electric companies, water utilities, major ports, all sold off to foreign investors. Assets that had once served the public now served the balance sheets of corporations. Decisions were no longer made in Athens. They were handed down from Brussels and Frankfurt, from unelected bodies and central banks. The narrative was still about solidarity, about European unity, but on the streets of Greece, it felt different. The so-called rescue was not for the people, it was for the system. The bailout money flowed in and then flowed out just as fast, straight to the banks and bondholders who had lent irresponsibly in the first place. Greece took on the risk, but others took home the profit. The crisis was not treated as a shared European problem. It was treated as a Greek failure, a moral story of a nation that lived beyond its means and now had to be disciplined. But the numbers told another story, and the people lived it every day. This was not recovery. It was control. Sovereignty had been traded, not for survival, but for structure, and structure always protects the lender first. They called it solidarity, but it felt like punishment. Greece had suffered in silence, but silence does not last forever. The people took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands marched across Athens. Protests surged, strikes paralyzed cities. Tear gas filled the air. What began as anger became unity. A nation stood up and demanded dignity. In 2015, hope had a name: Syriza, a radical left-wing party with a single promise: no more austerity. They won the election. And with that victory came something rare: a chance to choose. A referendum was called. The question was simple: accept the new bailout terms or reject them. The vote was overwhelming. 61% said no. No to more cuts. No to more foreign control. No to a future written by someone else. It was a moment of defiance of democracy, of reclaiming agency. But the celebration did not last. The Troika responded, not with negotiation, but with pressure. Capital controls were imposed. Greek banks were shut down. The economy was frozen overnight. Fear returned, and with it, compromise. Despite the public's vote, despite the promises, the government was forced to accept an even harsher deal: more cuts, more oversight, more debt. Hope turned to heartbreak. The referendum had spoken, but the system had spoken louder. It became clear debt is not just about money. It is about power. Austerity was not a mistake. It was a message. The rules were not neutral. They were designed to remind every debtor of their place. Greece resisted, but resistance came at a cost. Not just economic, but existential. Where does sovereignty end? When every decision needs foreign approval. Where does democracy end? When the people's voice is overruled by spreadsheets. Greece learned the answer. So did the world. Democracy ends where debt begins. The headlines moved on. The bailouts ended. The crisis was declared over. But the damage remained. The economy shrank by a quarter. A generation emigrated to find work. Public trust dissolved into cynicism. Greece still pays. Every month. Every year. Debt repayments stretched to the year 2060. Hospitals rebuilt with smaller budgets. Schools reopened with fewer teachers. Hope returned in fragments. But the scars are permanent. The system that broke Greece. It did not collapse. It adapted. It refined itself. And it expanded. Today, nations across the world walk the same edge. They borrow in currencies they do not print. They accept conditions set in foreign capitals. They privatize, liberalize, and sacrifice, all in the name of access to capital. And when trouble comes, they are offered lifelines with chains attached. In Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, the blueprint repeats. Austerity is sold as responsibility. Bailouts are framed as solidarity. But behind the language lies leverage, and leverage is power. What happened in Greece was not a fluke. It was not the failure of one government. It was the success of a system that rewards compliance and punishes defiance, a system that speaks the language of economics but writes the rules of politics. Greece was not an outlier. It was a mirror, a warning disguised as a case study. The next crisis may come with different flags, different currencies, different slogans, but the mechanics will feel familiar. The question is not if another country will break, it is who and when. And more importantly, will we recognize the pattern before it is too late? Because what began as a financial crisis ended as a democratic one. The lesson is not just about debt. It is about choice, about sovereignty, about whose voice counts when money speaks loudest. If Greece taught us anything, it is this: a nation can lose everything and still be told it was saved. If this gave you a new perspective, do not just scroll away, hit subscribe. This is Economic Chronicles, where history exposes the present and the future is written in the lessons we refuse to learn.